So, Paul, first question, conspiracy or something else? Egg prices. Are egg prices a conspiracy from poultry farmers, egg producers to raise prices?
Okay, so my first reaction would be to say, no way. This is, we had a real roller coaster on egg prices over the past few years. And it's very clear that it's about outbreaks of avian flu. Something kills a bunch of the chickens and you have to kill a bunch more to keep it from spreading. And that's been the big factor. Now, some of the egg producers have in fact been convicted of price fixing. There is more concentration in that industry than there used to be, although it's still not all that concentrated. It's not like meat packing where there's basically 4 companies, but there may be some price fixing conspiracy going on. It can't be the main story. The main story is avian flu, and it's a story possibly that when avian flu drives up prices, the big players take advantage of that to jack them up even a bit further than they have to. But I think it's a big mistake to think of that as more than a sort of a twiddle on the main story. The main story is dead chickens, basically.
Not politically motivated in any which way, right?
Oh, certainly not politically motivated. No, the price fixing is rarely about politics. It's about trying to exploit consumers, and there may have been some of that going on. And I can't. So yeah, it happens. Anyone who thinks that never happens is being naive. But it's also believing that that's the main story of egg prices these past few years. That's also being naive. It's just the swings are just much too big to be anything but basically these huge supply shocks.
So one more conspiracy question for you. Earlier last month, government revised down jobs, 800,000. Is that the government attempting to make the labor market previously look better to promote political aspirations? The 800,000 job revision. What was it?
Okay, now it might be helpful to notice that just last Thursday, 2 days ago, they revised GDP for the past 5 years up. So if there were people who were conspiring to, make the labor market look better and then finally, for some reason, decide they had to reveal the truth, were those same people conspiring to make the economy look worse than it really was? And then suddenly, it's kind of silly. And look, if this was a regularly scheduled revision, the companies do not, not every company in America reports how many employees it has every month. They take a limited sample. They extrapolate from that sample. It's especially hard because the set of companies is not fixed. Some companies go under, new companies enter, so they have what they call a birth-death model. And once a year, they do a revision because they do get I think, as I understand it, it's basically unemployment insurance, because every company has to pay into the unemployment insurance fund. They do once a year get a comprehensive data set that they can use to adjust the model. And there's always a revision. This was an unusually big one, but on the other hand, this has been an unusually crazy economy with the pandemic and its aftermath. So no, this was people seeing conspiracies under the bed where there really wasn't anything. Also, a plug, by the way, for anybody who's going to be doing economics. The U.S. statistical agencies, Bureau of Labor Statistics, in this case, Bureau of Economic Analysis, which does GDP. These are the sort of the best parts of our government. These are professional. They're dedicated. There's something that we do better pretty much than anybody else in terms of just having accurate as can be on the economy. But, an economy with 150 million workers and $25 trillion worth of output, anyone who thinks we have a precise read on everything that's happening, just think about the scale.
Okay, so if the Jobs adjustment and the GDP adjustment was not a conspiracy. What about the Fed rate cuts? Is that in response to the economy or is that politicking?
I think not cutting would have been politicking. I mean, where we are right now, at this point, it's funny, in a lot of ways, the economy looks like it did just before the pandemic. It looks like the economy of late 2019. We have about the same, actually slightly higher unemployment rate than we did. We have a slightly, but only slightly higher inflation rate. The Fed's preferred measure of inflation came in at 2.2% yesterday, which is within a whisker of its target of 2. But if you go back to late 2019, the Fed, the target top of its range, but the target interest rate was 1.75. And just before this latest cut, it was 5.5. Why should it have been so much higher than it was? Well, since inflation appears to have been pretty much beaten, at least for now, since the labor market is, if anything, a little bit weaker than it was back when the interest rate was 1.75, why wouldn't you cut interest rates? In fact, the question really should be, why didn't we do it sooner? I hope that we get to this as we go down the line, but there's no good argument that I can see that says that the rate, we try to talk about where we should end up. What is the neutral rate? It's got to be substantially below where we are even after that jumbo interest rate cut. So why not move quickly? So no, it would have been an amazing thing, very much a political thing, not to have cut. And we were worried about that the Fed would be so afraid of being attacked, they wouldn't do the economically obvious thing for fear of being seen as interfering with the election. But this was in fact the Fed saying, look, we're just going to do our job.
So along with that, in the projection material, if you dig in, you notice that the Fed throughout 2025 is saying unemployment's going to stay right around that 4.1, 4.2% number, but they revised down their projections of the target rate, right? If you looked at June, they were saying it was going to be 4 to 4.25. Now they're revising it down to 3.25, 3.5. Is that them signaling some economic weakness, so they have to respond more aggressively, or is that them just being able to, like you said, aggressively get back to normal?
Well, it's partly that they could feel, inflation has come down faster than they expected. So the good news on inflation is helping. And one of the things that's funny, we have the Fed has this, mystique, which it cultivates. They really know, and they have everything under control. And they certainly, on average over the years, they've done a really good job, but they don't know anything that lots of people don't know. The Fed doesn't have, maybe they know. I mean, I guess they knew 2 days ahead of the rest of us that Lehman Brothers was going to fail. But normally, the Fed has no relevant inside information. They're working off the same unemployment numbers, the same GDP numbers that the rest of us are, and so they're not. There isn't some signal of hidden information in their in what they're doing now. I think they have gotten a little bit worried about job developments going forward. The labor market, even though the unemployment rate is up, not drastically, but it is up. Some other measures, like the ratio of vacancies to workers looking for jobs, are signaling a weaker labor market. And the soft, all of this stuff is kind of witchcraft. I have to admit it. The stuff that we can all do, which is look at Fred and download unemployment numbers and all of that. That's the same data the Fed's working off. But there's soft indicators. The Fed has this thing, which I don't know how it came, but anyway, the Beige Book, where they just people from the regional Feds go out and talk to businesses and say, what's happening? How do you feel? And the last Beige Book was a little worrisome. Wasn't screaming recession, but it was definitely saying things feel softer. And over the years, I've seen this number of times. If the soft information, the kind of people's perception of the economy is signaling something different from what the hard numbers are saying. You want to take very seriously the possibility that something is happening that hasn't shown up. So it's not a recession out there, but a softening labor market, softening economy, probably. And I think they're kind of moving in that direction. Now, I hadn't checked. I think there's still their notion of what their long run, uh, where they think the Fed fund rate is going to be in the long run, has been hanging at about 3 for a while. So that's still where they think they will end up. But they may think that we will get there sooner than before.
Yeah, I think it was 2.8, 2.9 in the long run still. That didn't change. It was just
2.9,
the speed at which.
So I didn't.
Yeah.
Our star. This is such a jargon-heavy field that you have to work hard not to constantly be talking about words that nobody understands. But yeah, their estimate of our star appears to be 2.9, which, by the way, they don't know. They have models. Other people have models, but so it looks reasonable to me.
So if they're bringing these rates down a little bit more quickly, consumer spending remains robust. Are we concerned about what implications this might have for inflation in the near future?
Some people are concerned, and I'd be misrepresenting the state of affairs if I said that everybody is feeling unworried. It's definitely, I mean, the projections right now, the kind of people whose business it is to try and estimate what third quarter economic growth is going to be. And there are people who do it by models, and there are people who do it by sophisticated seat of the pants, but they're all pointing to the economy is still growing pretty strongly. But it's possible that the economy is not growing strongly enough to avoid some weakening in the labor market. Could the economy overheat? Could the Fed, by cutting rates, set off enough of a spending boom that unemployment drops substantially from where it is now and inflation starts to accelerate? I don't think that's the most likely case, but it certainly could happen. But historically, there's a lot of wiggle room before that sort of overheating actually translates into inflation or significant inflation. What happened in 2021, 2022, when we had this rapid acceleration of inflation, was very much the exceptional, was not the norm. Or, the jargon again, the Phillips curve is probably normally quite flat. And, there was this pandemic going on in 2021, 22, so that the normal rules may not have applied. It was a situation where the risk of waiting too long to raise rates or cutting rates prematurely, driving inflation, was probably much higher than it is in normal times. And right now, the economy looks almost eerily normal, right? It really does look like a kind of a normal economy operating in the vicinity of full employment, in the vicinity of target inflation. So we're probably not in a situation where inflation is going to suddenly take off.
So going away from inflation taking off, one of the questions that created a lot of attention is so I guess backtrack. In class, when I talk about an equilibrium, I tell my students, well, when a market's not in equilibrium. It's pretty obvious, pretty easy to tell. A soft landing. How do you define a soft landing? Is it one of these things where you know it when you see it, and if you don't have the soft landing? How do you convince the skeptics in the room that the Fed miraculously achieved this goal and hit the soft landing?
Okay, so if we're allowed to use words with slightly blurry meanings, a soft landing is getting to an acceptably low rate of inflation with an acceptably low unemployment rate without having to go through a nasty recession to get there. And then the question is, what's acceptably low? And beforehand, there were some people who did put numbers, a little bit arbitrary, but I'm pretty sure that Jason Furman, who has been one of the big players in this debate, I think got a lot of scrupulous. I think he got some of it wrong, but never mind. He said his definition of a soft landing in advance was unemployment below 4.5 and inflation below 3, which he thought was only a 10% chance of happening when he wrote that down. Well, guess what? We have 4.2% unemployment and 2.2% inflation by the Fed's preferred measure. So this is what a soft landing looks like. Now, can we keep it? Is the plane, there's really never, it never ends. It's not like the plane is on the runway and that's the end of the story. Are we descending too fast? Is the economy weakening and the Fed has waited too long so that the pilot actually pull up the nose in time, or did she pull up the nose too soon and we're going to bounce off the runway? That's the inflation scenario. But where we are now, I was about to say, if you told people that we would be in this situation of really historically low unemployment and inflation almost exactly at target, that people would have said that was unlikely. And specifically, some people who were willing to put numbers on it thought there was only a 10% chance that we would do it, but we did. We should be having ticker tape parades down Fifth Avenue.
This be complicated in any way by the persistent tariffs? We know from earlier in the session that tariffs raise prices, and we know that this changes who's employed in the US and who's employed in Mexico. So the persistent tariffs that the US government has against China in particular, but also generally this kind of restriction of trade that we've seen, reversal from the trend from the early 2000s. Is this going to complicate the soft landing at all?
What we have so far is already baked in. Any effect that the tariffs, so we had a bunch of tariffs that were imposed under Trump and were kept under Biden. And but that's already, they've been there now for 4 years or more. And if they were going to cause an inflation problem beyond whatever effect they had, we would have seen it. And what we have so far, although it was a lot of noise, a lot of fury, and a lot of break with tradition, after generations of being the great champion of free trade, the United States started to turn protectionist. But what we have, by the numbers, we're still talking about only a small percentage of U.S. trade is affected. Now, you may be aware that there's an election coming up, and Donald Trump says, and I don't see any reason not to take it seriously, that he wants to have tariffs of 10%, he sometimes says 20, but at least 10% on everything and 60% on China, which is a vastly, vastly bigger tariff hit than anything that he did when he was in office. So that's different. Now we're talking about adding probably a couple of points directly to inflation, simply from the tariffs, and then possible indirect consequences. So I think talking about the tariffs we have now, they would have seemed like a big deal 10 years ago when nobody thought that things like this would happen, but they're not really that big in a macro sense. But the stuff that might happen next year, that is definitely a big deal.
We're seeing some of these rises in populist policy. The tariffs, obviously passed by Trump, supported by the Biden administration because they are politically popular. Another area we are seeing rise is in price controls, rent controls. You had a proposal that there's going to be a cap on interest rates. This is a standard, principles question, but how is that going to play out with rent controls in this housing market that we are seeing some struggles in?
Yeah, in a way, this goes back to the chickens and the eggs a little bit, right? That there's, is the rental market a chapter 3 of Krugman Wells? Is it a supply and demand market with perfect competition? And the answer is no, not exactly. There's clearly frictions. landlords have a little bit of market power because tenants can't easily move. It's kind of there's definitely reasons to think that a perfect market's position is not quite right, and you can make an argument. In fact, I have a grad student who just graduated from CUNY Grad Center on imperfect competition in rental markets and housing in New York City. It's a real thing that happens, and when that's happening, then within limits, a little bit of price control needn't cause harm. And we have a sort of related story of minimum wages. That's a price controlling the price up instead of down. That should lead to unemployment, except we have really extensive empirical evidence that if there are any effects like that in the United States in the range of minimum wages that we have experienced, it doesn't really happen. That you don't actually seem to lose at least a measurable number of jobs. On rental markets, the thing is, we have a lot of experience with actually existing rent controls, and they almost always end up becoming extremely restrictive and producing shortages. And of course, people get once they've existed for a while, people are extremely angry at the idea of removing them or substantially raising the rents for natural human reasons. But I am really skeptical that that you can accomplish very much with rent controls without starting to cause serious shortages of housing and serious disruption. It's one of those things where nobody loves landlords, often for very good reason, and it's really tempting. And we do again. We do know that some landlords have been using clever software to collude to try and keep rents a little bit higher. So it's not that this doesn't happen, but the idea that you can do a whole lot to alleviate the cost of housing with rent controls is almost certainly wrong. And the big problem is, in fact, we just don't allow enough housing to get built. That's it's not saying that greedy landlords and collusion and big corporations buying stuff up and restricting supply, all of that does happen some places and sometimes, but it's almost certainly not a big part of the story. So rent controls is not the answer. It can become so problematic if they become strongly binding.
About rent controls and Fed rate cuts and inflation and tariffs.
Oh.
These are things that our students are really, really interested in. And so what should we as educators be prioritizing when we're helping our students apply economic concepts to these real world policy problems?
Okay, yeah. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention interest rate controls, this was really odd. I mean, this was Donald Trump throwing out. I'm not sure that there was any serious discussion, but the idea of putting a cap on credit card interest rates. And there, again, God knows, the credit card issuers are definitely not in the business for your health, and and in many cases they are big banks with substantial market power. But putting a hard cap on credit card interest rates would probably mean that lots of people couldn't get cards. I think that this is a hard balance to strike. I mean, everybody should know supply and demand, and simple supply and demand tells us that the market that the markets have prices that they want to set. That there is, got these two crossing lines, and where they cross is the market's equilibrium price. Nothing says that it's fair or right or just, but it is very hard to, most of the time, to move away from that price without lots of unpleasant side consequences. Now, when you teach that, you have to making it a straight, the market is always right. I think, aside from not being true, I think also probably hurts credibility with students. I think students have enough sense of the real world to know that things aren't always that collusion on prices happens, that market power happens, that to take as I said, eggs I'm skeptical about, but there are basically only 4 meat packers in America. To imagine that the price of meat is really a competitive market where the supply and demand curves cross is clearly not right. And we have a lot of evidence that minimum wages really don't fit the paradigm that says that they must lead to unemployment. So you need to acknowledge the exceptions, but also but also make it clear that they are the exceptions. That 85% of the time, simple supply and demand, competitive markets approach is right. Not 100%, but most of the time. And there are real costs to trying to push away from that, trying to set prices where you think they would be more fair, has just very often had nasty consequences. So shortages, black markets, just all of the things that can go a little crazy when you go away from that. That's why we have a chapter, as do our competitors. We lay out supply and demand. Then we talk about what happens when you try to intervene, which is not that the wrath of heaven always comes raining down upon you when you do, but that sometimes it does, and that there are real difficulties. So I understand. I mean, I've been there. Both in front of classrooms and, of course, in the textbook writing, trying to keep that balance, that supply and demand is a tremendously powerful tool for thinking about the world, but that doesn't mean it's always right. But the fact that it isn't always right doesn't mean that it's always wrong either. You need to be able to accept the subtleties, and market forces are real and powerful, and they're very hard to defy. So now, this is be a lot easier to teach this stuff. Right? It'd be a lot easier to teach economics if it was straight. This is an iron law. The law of supply and demand, then defy it, and thunderbolts will rain down upon you. And I think you lose credibility with students if you say that, because it's clearly not true. But nonetheless, and so kind of and especially, by the way, there's actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to wander a little bit. If you guys will forgive me, it's also true that what the prices that supply and demand give you it's equilibrium, but that doesn't mean that it's right or fair. And there are times when we really do not feel that it's okay to let the market do what it was. So if people who sell bottled water at wildly inflated prices in the aftermath of a hurricane, not too idle a story at the moment, we tend to think of that as being wrong. That's price gouging, and it offends our sense of justice, and we don't think that people should be allowed to do it, even though to a certain extent our model says, well, that's the efficient thing. Sometimes fairness trumps efficiency, but on the other hand, the efficiency thing is always really there.
So I'm curious whether you agree with the statement that the Fed has been consistently behind the curve, basically, for the past, say, 3.5 years. And if so, why? What are they doing wrong?
Okay, I actually don't believe that they've been, let's put it this way, I don't believe they've been behind the curve in terms of what matters. They were clearly slow to recognize that this inflation surge was much bigger and likely to be much more persistent than they realized. Would it have made a difference if they had started raising rates sooner? And that's become a really hard case to make, because if you look at it's really kind of amazing. If you look at comparable measures, harmonized index of consumer prices, it has risen by almost exactly the same amount all across the wealthy world. Euro area cumulative inflation since the beginning of the pandemic is within tenths of a percentage point of U.S. cumulative inflation. So if there was really a phenomenon that was driven by spillover effects from the pandemic, which is now what appears to be the case, how much could the Fed have done to, if it had moved sooner, how much could it have done to have avoided that? Short of actually pushing the economy into recession, not so bad. I do think I wish the Fed had started cutting sooner on the other end. So, by the way, so that's for stage one. We had a completely unprecedented, or almost unprecedented, inflation episode. The closest thing to it is kind of the mobilization after World War II. But it's not like nothing we've seen for generations. Then it's faded out, and I would have liked the Fed to start cutting sooner. I think it was misled this time by a really technical issue, which it looks like the seasonal adjustments are wrong. There's something, we're now seeing a persistent pattern where inflation rises in the first few months of the year and then falls. And that's because lots of firms reset their prices early in the year, but the seasonal adjustment is supposed to take care of that, and it doesn't appear to be doing its job. So the Fed was under the illusion that inflation was persistent early this year, and that was almost certainly just noise. It wasn't really happening. But we haven't had a recession. I'd be telling a very different story if the economy had drastically weakened because the Fed waited this long to cut. And maybe that story is ahead of us. But so far, I actually really find it hard to see how, in general, the United States could have done much better than it did. We got about the same inflation as everybody else, probably built in as a result of the just been cast into darkness here. A switch. Anyway, I'm looking a little dramatic, I guess. But anyway, we had we've had more, I think, more or less the inflation that we had to have to deal with the effects of the pandemic. We've had a solid performance, really solid, on growth and employment. Where would we have done better? I don't think we could have avoided the inflation. I think we got about as much growth as we could. So I don't think, it feels almost embarrassing to say I don't think we did anything particularly wrong, but I don't see that we made any big mistakes.
Just one question about what you just said. So there is a reality to central bank actions today in that they are across the world somewhat coordinated, not, I guess, with the exception of Bank of Japan right now. Do you think that, yes, maybe the Fed acting alone in 2021, 2022, or starting to raise rates in 21, 2022 would have not done much effect, but they do sort of kick off a cascading effect across all central banks, in which case, if it was more coordinated, do you think we would have potentially not seen as much inflation?
And that's a really good question. But I actually don't see it. The story I tell now is, look, we had the pandemic disrupted a bunch of stuff, and that meant that the prices of some goods and services, whether it was international shipping or durable goods, had to go up. There were things that were in short supply. Wages probably had to go up because we had a temporary reduction in labor force participation. The only way to have avoided having overall inflation as opposed to prices of particular things going up would have been for the prices of lots of other stuff to go down. And prices really don't want to go down, right? Prices are downward sticky, and wages especially are downward sticky. So the only way to have avoided this, and whether it was the Fed acting alone, I'm not sure how much spillover there is between the actions of central banks in different countries, but leaving that aside, if we tried to avoid a significant rise in the overall price level, we could only have done that by having a lot of deflation outside the disrupted sectors. And that would have been extremely costly in terms of employment. So accepting, I mean, the thing that was the great concern was that inflation would get entrenched, that people would start to expect continuing inflation, and that then it would be really hard. Then it would have been like the 1970s all over again. And that's why even though I believed that it was transitory, that it was these shocks, I didn't complain about the Fed raising rates because it was really important to head off that possibility. But as it turned out, it didn't. What we got was effectively a one-time jump in the level of prices, and then leveling off at the previous trend of prices, but just at a higher level. I mean, taking this jog upwards during the pandemic and its immediate aftermath. Can you tell me a story where we would have avoided that without a lot more unemployment along the way?